Good afternoon, everybody. Today is the 25th of May, and we're going to jump into the 7th episode of the Lynette Hooker Disappearance. And this one is Voices from the Water, Witnesses and Unraveling Timeline. In the days following Lynette's disappearance, attention shifted. It shifted towards the people who lived closest to the water, the residents, the boaters, and longtime mariners around Abaco. Their accounts didn't just add detail, they exposed new fractures in the story that Brian had given investigators. There was a report of the splash. One of the most significant statements came from a resident near the anchorage where Soulmate was moored. The witness reported hearing a massive splash around 9:30 p.m. That was more than 2 hours after Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn. This detail immediately raised questions. 1. Brian claimed Lynette fell overboard long before 9:30. 2. The splash came from the direction of the Soulmate, not open waters. And 3. No other boats were reported in the area at that time. With this single account, the timeline Brian had repeated began to show its first major break. The locals questioned the drift pattern once again. Experienced mariners familiar with the Sea of Abaco told investigators that Brian's drift account just didn't match the conditions of that evening. They noted that the wind should have pushed the dinghy toward Elbow Cay, not away. They also told them the distance to March Harbor was too great for the drift and for the time that Brian reported. And 3, the dinghy should have reached the land far sooner. This is all things that we have heard before, but now mariners and seasoned people that have been in the Bahamas for years and know those waters, they're coming forward and they're confirming all of these different variations of Brian's story. These weren't formal forensic conclusions, but they carried weight, and each observation chipped away at the plausibility of Brian's first version of the events. Some locals reported seeing a dinghy moving erratically earlier in the evening, though none could confirm it was Brian's. Others remarked that the anchorage around Soulmate was unusually quiet for a Saturday night, making the 9:30 splash even more distinct. As the investigators compared these statements to Brian's accounts, the inconsistencies were beginning to multiply. What had once been a single narrative was now spitting and spilling into competing versions with each other, versions of the night that were different from what he had told authorities to start off with. Brian was starting to get confused. A timeline under strain. By the first week, Brian's statements were no longer simply being reviewed. They were being tested. And with each new witness account, the structure of his timeline continued to weaken. What once seemed like a straightforward boating accident now looked increasingly unstable. Brian's story was beginning to crumble. However, no charges were brought forth against him. He was strictly being questioned. For Lynette's family, the new witnesses' accounts, the information was not bringing any clarity. It was bringing more concern, more unease. The splash, the silence around the anchorage, the contradiction in the timeline, each detail pushed the possibility of an accident further and further out of reach for them. They were getting more concerned every single moment of the day. Locals who were on the water that night felt unsettled by what they heard and what they didn't hear. The 9:30 splash lingered in many of their minds, loud, sudden, and coming from the direction of the soulmate at a time when, according to Brian, no one should have been anywhere near the boat. Nobody was definitely on the boat, in his words. The witness statements didn't just fracture his timeline, they changed the tone of this entire case. What began as confusion was now shifting toward suspicion. And as the weight of those contradictions settled in, Lynette's family made a decision. They would no longer rely on initial narrative. They would no longer rely on Brian's statements. They would continue, though, for one thing, and that would to be pushing forward, pushing deeper, and they wanted a much more aggressive investigation into the disappearance of not just a mother and a daughter, but to find Lynette Hooker. So that concludes today's chapter in the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. The investigation continues. There is a lot more to uncover, so please stay tuned for the next episode, which will be episode number 8, and that will be posting actually later this evening. I've gotten a little bit behind, so I want to get everything caught up so you guys have current information every day. The search for answers is far from over, and there's a lot more questions still out there.